Hello and welcome to a short overview of the Red Scare in the United States. I'm going to talk really about predominantly two periods: the period right after the Russian Revolution in 1917 and then in the 1950s in greater detail. So there's two Red Scares. The first Red Scare occurs in the wake of World War I. The Russian Revolution, which takes place in 1917, sees the Bolsheviks, which is a political party led by Vladimir Lenin, ends up toppling the Romanov dynasty. They kill the Tsar and all his family and kicks off the rise of the Communist Party. This inspires widespread international fear amongst all Western European nations that communism might spread further west. Doesn't end up happening in the 1920s, but it's still a fear that sits out there regardless. In the United States, there's a couple of things that are happening in the post World War I era that tend to lead people to be a little bit concerned about communism. In the United States, labor strikes were on the rise, and the press tended to sensationalize them as being caused by and large by immigrants, especially immigrants from Eastern and Southeastern Europe. These, they claimed, were just bent on bringing down the American way of life. And so, in response to these allegations, Congress passed what was called the Sedition Act of 1918. The Sedition Act of 1918 targeted people who criticized the government in writing, monitored radicals and labor union leaders. And the goal was, through threat of deportation, to get people to stop criticizing the American government, business at large, and to try to tamp down some of the growing labor movements in the United States. The fear turned to violence with the 1919 anarchist bombings, because after World War I, you're seeing not only the rise of a communist party in a lot of states, but also an anarchist party. In 1919, there's a series of bombings targeting law enforcement and government offices in the United States. Bombs went off in a number of cities, including Boston, Cleveland, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and New York City. And so, as a response to this, the Red Scare climaxes really in 1919 and 1920, and I'm talking about the first Red Scare here. And this is when United States Attorney General Mitchell Palmer orders what's called the Palmer Raids. These are a series of violent enforcement raids by the police targeting leftist radicals and anarchists. This is tied together with a period of social unrest that is called the Red Summer of 1919 and 1920. So the Palmer Raids are really a part of the Red Summer Scare. Now, by and large, by the time the Great Depression hits, the first Red Scare is long in the past. But following World War II, which ends in 1945, the Democratic United States and Communist Soviet Union become engaged in a series of largely political and economic clashes known as the Cold War. It's called the Cold War because what we have are a series of proxy conflicts, which means the United States and the Soviet Union never fight each other directly. Instead, they're engaged in fighting each other through different countries. Our involvement in the Vietnam War is a perfect example of a proxy conflict. The intensity between these two superpowers raised concerns in the United States that communists and leftist sympathizers inside America might actively work as Soviet spies and therefore pose a threat to American security. Such ideas, by the way, weren't totally unfounded. The USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, had long carried out espionage activities inside America and with the aid of United States citizens, particularly during World War II. As concerns about Soviet influence grew as the Cold War heated up, no pun intended, the US leaders decided that they were going to take action. And so on March the 21st, 1947, President Harry Truman issues what is called the Executive Order 9835, or as it's most commonly known, the Loyalty Order. The Loyalty Order mandated that all federal employees be analyzed, which means you could be brought in, you could be questioned, you could have all of your past examined to determine whether they were sufficiently loyal to the government. Truman's loyalty program was a startling development, frankly, for a country that prizes concepts of personal liberty and freedom of political thought. However, it's only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the major Red Scare of the late 1940s and early 1950s. As we go on, things get a lot worse. Most of the efforts to investigate communist activities in the United States, or allegations of communist activities, took place in Congress, not in the office of the president. And specifically, we're really talking about the House of Representatives, where the House Un-American Activities Committee, otherwise known as HUAC, is formed back in 1938. HUAC's investigations frequently focus on exposing communists working inside the federal government or quote unquote subversive elements working in major industries, especially the Hollywood film industry. And the committee gained huge momentum following World War II. During World War II, it was not a prestigious community or committee to be a part of. But as the Cold War begins, suddenly it is where all the action is happening. And so, under pressure from negative publicity aimed at their studios, movie executives created what were called Hollywood blacklists. These Hollywood blacklists barred suspected radicals from employment, and similar lists were also established in other industries. One of the big problems about all this, of course, is that many of these blacklists were created based on your previous films produced. And don't forget, during World War II, the Soviet Union was one of our two major allies. So there had been pro-Russia films made in the past. The most important name to know when it comes to the Red Scare in the 1950s is Senator Joseph R. McCarthy of my home state, Wisconsin. He is definitely the person who's most closely associated with the anti-communist crusade. McCarthy, who, by the way, dies of alcoholism and is a severe alcoholic throughout his entire life, tended to use mostly hearsay and intimidation to establish himself as a powerful and feared figure in American politics. He just tended to shoot charges of disloyalty at anybody who he could think of, celebrities, intellectuals, anyone who disagrees with his political views, costing many of these victims their reputations and their jobs. He was very famous in saying, quote, "I have a list." According to him, he had this list of communists that you weren't allowed to see, but he had this list of communists that he was going to make clear at any point, and he would just brandish the list about and make accusations. McCarthy's reign of terror continued until finally people had had enough of his tactics in 1954. Really, what takes down Joseph McCarthy is he starts to go after the Army. And when he goes after the Army is an extremely powerful organization in the United States. One Army lawyer famously asked McCarthy in one of these hearings, "Have you no decency, sir?" when he was questioning a certain Army officer's loyalty. And again, I know I said this before, but it's worth repeating. We were allies with the Soviet Union during World War II. So it kind of makes sense that individuals in our armed forces would have had communications and relationships with officers in the Soviet Red Army as well. So if McCarthy is one side of the coin for the Red Scare, the other side of the coin is FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI, and its longtime director, J. Edgar Hoover, who was a director for years upon years, aided many of the legislative investigations into communist activities. Hoover was obsessed with finding communists. In fact, repeated presidents, as he gets older, will become incredibly frustrated with J. Edgar Hoover that he does not want to investigate, say, organized crime. Instead, he becomes absolutely driven to find communists, even where there is no evidence of any communists ever being present. For example, he's going to do a lot of wiretapping on such figures that you may know, like Martin Luther King Jr., who was not a communist, but J. Edgar Hoover became convinced that he was. So, with the dawning of the new anti communist crusade in the late 1940s, Hoover's FBI agency compiled extensive files on suspected subversives through the use of wiretaps, surveillance, and spies within leftist organizations. The information obtained by the FBI proved essential in high profile legal cases, including the conviction of 12 prominent leaders of the American Communist Party on charges that they had advocated the overthrow of the government in 1949. Moreover, Hoover's agents helped to build the case against, this is probably the most famous communist case. It's called the Rosenberg trials. It's actually against a husband and wife, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were both convicted of espionage in 1951 and were the only two people who were executed based off of those convictions in the United States as part of the Red Scare. Now, public concerns about communism were heightened by international events that were going on at the same time. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested a nuclear bomb, and communist forces led by Mao Zedong took control of China. The following year, 1950, the Korean War began, which engaged United States troops in combat against the communist-supported forces of North Korea. This is why today we have a North Korea and a South Korea. The advancement of communism around the world, China's a big country. The fact that China became communist almost overnight convinced many American citizens that was a real danger of the quote unquote Reds taking over their country. Figures like McCarthy and Hoover fanned these flames of fear by wildly exaggerating the possibility. As the Red Scare intensified, its political climate turned increasingly conservative. Elected officials on both sides of the aisle tried to portray themselves as staunch anti-communists, and few people dared to criticize unquestionable tactics used to persecute suspected radicals. Membership in leftist communist groups plummeted as it became clear that any association with them would lead to serious personal consequences. In judicial affairs, for example, support for free speech and civil liberties dropped dramatically. This trend was symbolized by the 1951 Supreme Court ruling in Dennis versus the United States. Dennis versus the United States was the ruling that said free speech rights of accused communists can be restricted because their actions presented a clear and present danger to the government. So again, if you look at it from sort of a macro level, the case represents a change in America. We go from the country where free speech is sacrosanct to a country in which free speech is okay as long as it aligns with our ideals, part of the Red Scare. Long-term effects. So Americans felt the effects of the Red Scare on a personal level. Thousands upon thousands of alleged communists saw their lives totally disrupted. You could be hounded by law enforcement, alienated from friends and family, and fired from your job. While a very small number of these people may have been aspiring revolutionaries, most were just the victims of false allegations and had done nothing more than exercise their right to join a political party. Though the fear and repression began to ease in the late 1950s, by the time we get to Kennedy in the 1960s, it's much less of an issue. The Red Scare has continued to influence political debate in decades since, and it's often cited as an example of how unfounded fears can compromise civil liberties. The famous play The Crucible by Arthur Miller, while actually about technically the Salem witch trials, was clearly a veiled criticism of the Red Scare. But still, these ideals are with us today, and it's worth remembering every time scare tactics come up. Is it worth sacrificing our ideals because of the most recent scare?